They thought no one would care. A sick puppy left to die in a box, abandoned beneath the cold whisper of Montana pines. No name, no blanket, just silence. But then, a stray cat appeared, not to hunt, not to leave, but to lie beside him, to give warmth, to give life. This isn't a rescue story. It's a story of how a wild heart, with no words, reminded a broken town what love still sounds like. Red Pine Campground slumbered beneath a heavy Montana sky, where the late autumn air carried the scent of pine resin, wet bark, and ash. The day had ended with a copper-red sunset, casting long shadows over the forest trails. Now, the wind murmured through towering evergreens, sifting gently over a dimly flickering campfire that barely clung to life. A few final embers pulsed orange beneath a layer of cooling ash. At the edge of the clearing, a cardboard box sat half-collapsed near the remnants of the fire pit. Damp from the dew and faintly scorched at the corner, it bore the faded image of a grocery store logo. Inside it lay a small figure, curled, unmoving, and frail. The puppy was no more than 6 or 7 weeks old, with a light tan coat streaked by mud and soot. His ribs showed through his skin, and his breath, if any, was too faint to see. His eyes were shut tight, lashes clumped with dried tears, or perhaps illness. His tail, once curled eagerly perhaps, lay still and matted against the box's base. A small blue collar, frayed at the edge, remained buckled around his neck. No name tag, no blanket, just silence. Earlier that day, a group of teenagers had passed through the campground, rowdy, careless, loud. They had brought marshmallows, cans of beer, and music blaring from a Bluetooth speaker. One of them, a freckled boy in a varsity jacket, had held the box as if it were a chore rather than a burden. "My sister's mutt got sick," he'd muttered to a friend. "I told her I'd take it to the shelter, but..." He'd shrugged, tossing the box near the fire before cracking open a soda. They'd left before sundown. Not one looked back. As dusk fell into darkness, the forest reclaimed the space. Crickets clicked quietly, an owl hooted in the distance, and then, just past midnight, soft paws approached the edge of the clearing. She moved like a ghost, her shape emerging from shadows with quiet dignity. A feral cat, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, with thick silvery gray fur laced with darker stripes like ripples on water. Her frame was lean but muscled from a life lived in the woods, tail low, eyes sharp amber and glowing faintly in the dark. Her ears twitched with every whisper of the night, and her steps were deliberate. This was Whiskers, a name no one had given her, but one that the forest perhaps understood. She had lived on the outskirts of Willow Creek for years, rarely seen but often whispered about by rangers and hikers. Some said she was born feral. Others believed she'd once belonged to an old woman who vanished into the woods one winter and never returned. Whatever her story, Whiskers had learned to survive, and not just survive, but protect. She paused at the edge of the fire pit, nose twitching. The scent of smoke, char, and something else, familiar, faint. Her eyes shifted to the box. Slowly, cautiously, she approached it. Her ears perked as she peered inside. The puppy's form did not move. She sniffed his flank once, twice, still warm, but barely. No growl came, no twitch of tail. Still, Whiskers didn't retreat. Instead, she circled the box, stepping once, then twice, before slowly lowering herself beside it. She curled her body around the limp form, wrapping her tail over him like a blanket, pressing her side close to his. Her breathing remained steady, slow, not quite asleep, but resting, watching, guarding. Minutes turned into an hour. The fire had long died, leaving only pale coals and curling smoke. The wind picked up briefly, rattling pine branches overhead, but Whiskers didn't move. The forest, too, seemed to hush around her, as if holding its breath. Somewhere far beyond the campground, at the edge of Willow Creek, lights flickered in the window of the forest outpost, where a lone ranger, Jonas Reid, dozed beside a lantern and a cooling mug of coffee. But Jonas's story had not yet entered this one. Not tonight. For now, the night belonged to the cat and the dying dog, and the quiet warmth between two forgotten souls.
The sun crept shyly over the horizon, painting the tall pines of Red Pine Campground in a misty wash of amber. The cold still clung to the forest floor, but the first warmth of morning hinted that the frost would soon surrender. Birds began their tentative songs as the wind picked up again, gently scattering needles across the quiet clearing. Jonas Reid walked alone, his boots crunching softly against the damp earth. He was a tall man in his early 40s with a solid, weather-beaten build shaped by years in the mountains. His short dark blonde hair was streaked with early gray, and a well-trimmed beard framed his square jaw. His uniform, a forest green ranger jacket with a weathered leather patch on the shoulder, fit him like a second skin. He was not the talkative kind, but no one in Willow Creek ever said Jonas wasn't dependable. People trusted him because the forest did. He had lived alone at the ranger station for the past 8 years, ever since his wife, Clara, died in a landslide during a field survey. Jonas had never fully recovered from that loss. He didn't seek people anymore. He spoke with trees, listened to streams, and answered the howls of wolves with a quiet nod, as if acknowledging old acquaintances. But on this particular morning, the forest had something to say, and it said it through silence, a stillness that wasn't natural. He veered off the main trail as instinct pulled him toward the old campfire ring by Red Pine's eastern clearing. That's when he saw them. A cardboard box sat half-folded beneath the ash of a forgotten fire pit. Curled beside it was a gray-striped cat, thick-furred, unmoving, tail wrapped tightly around what Jonas thought, at first, was just another lump of debris. But then the light shifted, and he saw the tan fur, the delicate snout, the unmoving chest of a puppy nestled in the crook of the cat's body. Jonas crouched, exhaling through his nose. "What the hell?" he murmured, voice more reverent than surprised. He reached out slowly. The cat stirred but didn't flee. Her amber eyes blinked up at him, measured, intelligent, protective. With gentle care, Jonas unzipped his jacket, lifted the puppy's limp body into his arms, and then, after a brief hesitation, tucked the cat in against it. The cat made no sound. She merely nestled closer. "I guess you're both coming with me," he muttered, standing. Elsewhere in Willow Creek, just past the edge of Sleepy Schoolhouse framed by golden maples, Grace Miller adjusted her scarf and looked over a group of third-graders bouncing with field trip excitement. Grace was 29, with a gentle, athletic build and auburn curls tucked messily beneath a knit beanie. Her face had a quiet, steady kindness to it, the kind that didn't shout but soothed. She wore practical boots, a quilted jacket, and a canvas tote filled with notebooks, crayons, and emergency snacks. She had only moved to Willow Creek 6 weeks earlier, trading the bustle of Portland for small-town stillness after a heartbreak too deep to leave untouched. A miscarriage in her second trimester had ended not just her pregnancy, but her relationship with the man she had once believed would be her family. The grief had pushed her toward the edges of the world, and Willow Creek had answered. She had thrown herself into her students, into routine, into the natural world she had once only read about. Today was their first forest ecology walk, and she wanted it to matter. "All right, explorers," she said to the group. "Let's keep our eyes open for tracks. Who knows what kind of animals passed through last night?" A chorus of excitement bubbled behind her. They were approaching a narrow trail that connected to the ranger station when she spotted him, Jonas, emerging from the trees with something wrapped in his coat. Grace slowed instinctively. Jonas noticed her, gave a silent nod, and kept walking until he was within earshot. "Morning," she said carefully. Are you carrying a dog?" Jonas stopped. "Puppy," he replied. "Barely alive." Grace moved closer, concern lining her brow. The children behind her quieted as they sensed something unusual. And then she saw the cat. Nestled beside the puppy in Jonas's coat, the gray-striped feline looked back at her without fear. "I'm Grace," she said gently. "I teach at the elementary school. Do you need help?" Jonas studied her for a long moment, then gave a small shrug. "If you've got experience with animals, yeah." "I do," she replied. "I worked with a vet for 3 summers in college. Can I come with you?" Jonas nodded. "Station's just ahead." She turned to the children. "All right, explorers, we're going to make a slight detour. Emergency forest rescue." Cheers followed her as the group trailed behind Jonas. Inside the ranger station, an old wooden structure surrounded by moss and nestled against a slow-moving creek, Grace took charge. She cleared a corner bench, fetched clean towels, and helped Jonas carefully lay down the puppy and the cat. The puppy's breathing was shallow but still present. Whiskers lay beside him, pressing her warmth into his flank, eyes wary but calm. "We need to hydrate him," Grace said. "Warm fluids, just a little at a time." Jonas heated broth on the stovetop while Grace dipped a rag in warm water to clean the puppy's eyes and paws. "What happened out there?" she asked quietly. "Don't know," Jonas said. "Teenagers, maybe." Fire pit was still warm. And the cat, already there, guarding him. Grace looked at the feline again with quiet wonder. She saved him. The ranger gave a short nod. "Seems so." As the children watched with wide eyes and silent awe, Grace and Jonas worked together for hours, feeding, cleaning, monitoring. By mid-afternoon, the puppy stirred faintly, a small whimper rising from his throat. Grace smiled for the first time in days. Jonas, seeing it, almost smiled back. Outside, the forest whispered, and somewhere in that silence, something shifted. 2 strangers drawn together not by fate, but by a stray cat and the flicker of hope she had guarded in the night. Night fell gently over Willow Creek, wrapping the ranger station in a soft veil of fog and frost. The creek beside the wooden cabin murmured steadily, echoing through the tall, dark trees that loomed like silent sentinels. The wind had died down, but the cold remained, clinging to the windows, slipping under doors, and breathing into the bones of the mountain. Inside, the fire cracked softly in the stone hearth, casting flickering gold across the room. On the floor near the fire, a nest of towels and flannel blankets had been carefully arranged to cradle the fragile body of the puppy. He lay motionless, save for the slow rise and fall of his chest, so shallow it was barely perceptible. His fur, though still dirty and patchy in places, had dried, warmed by hours of steady heat and the careful placement of warm water bottles. Curled against him, nose tucked gently into his neck, was Whiskers. Her thick silver-gray fur glowed faintly in the firelight, and her amber eyes blinked slowly, never leaving him. Jonas Reid sat nearby on the worn leather couch, elbows resting on his knees, calloused fingers steepled as he watched. His ranger jacket had been hung by the door. Now he wore only a flannel shirt and wool undershirt, both wrinkled from the long day. His gaze, usually fixed and unreadable, was now quietly anxious. He had seen plenty of death in the forest. Injured deer, abandoned cubs, even wolves riddled with disease. But something about this small creature had carved its way into his guarded heart. And, perhaps more strangely, something about the cat. Across the room, Grace Miller prepared a shallow bowl of gruel, stirring carefully. Her auburn curls were tied up messily beneath a wool beanie, and dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her movements were practiced and patient. She had sent her students home hours earlier, gently promising their parents updates in the morning. Now, in the amber light, she looked almost like someone who belonged here, fitting into the quiet rhythm of this place, as though she'd always been part of it. "He hasn't moved in over 2 hours," Jonas murmured. Grace turned. "That's not necessarily bad. Rest can be healing." She crossed the room with the bowl and crouched by the pup. "Let's try again." Using a small plastic spoon, she dipped it into the gruel and held it near the pup's mouth. Whiskers looked up for a moment, but didn't move. "Come on, little guy," Grace whispered. "You've come this far." She touched the edge of the spoon gently to his lips, letting a warm drop touch his tongue. For a moment, nothing. Then, barely a twitch. Grace leaned closer. Then it happened. A faint jerk, like a hiccup. The pup's paw shifted, no more than half an inch. Whiskers lifted her head and gave a sharp, deliberate meow. And then a soft gasp. A breath pulled deeper than before. Then another. Rusty stirred, legs twitching faintly. Grace's eyes welled instantly. "Jonas," she whispered. He moved. The ranger was already on his feet, crouching beside her. Holy hell! As they watched, the pup's eyelids fluttered once, then again, and finally opened. His eyes were a deep, cloudy brown, barely focused, but alive. Grace pressed a hand to her mouth. Rusty whimpered softly, a thin, pitiful sound. But it was sound. Whiskers gave a quiet purr and pressed her nose into his neck again. "It's a miracle," Grace murmured. Jonas exhaled slowly. "It's the cat," he said, voice thick. She never left him, even when he seemed gone. They spent the rest of the night in careful shifts. Grace fed him in tiny spoonfuls every hour. Jonas cleaned his paws gently with warm cloths. Whiskers moved only to stretch, then curled back around him. No one questioned her presence anymore. In the early hours, just before dawn, there was a knock at the door. Jonas opened it to find Martha Kincaid, the local wildlife rehab volunteer. A retired nurse in her late 60s, she was short and compact, with wiry gray hair tucked beneath a beaded wool cap. Her eyes were sharp behind square-frame glasses, and her parka bore a half-dozen patches from conservation groups across the state. "Heard you had a patient," she said, brushing snow from her boots. Jonas stepped aside, and she entered with a medical bag slung over one shoulder. "Grace called me." Grace appeared from the kitchen, tired but smiling. "I thought we could use a second opinion." Martha knelt by the puppy, already pulling on gloves. She looked him over carefully, touching his ribs, examining his eyes, ears, and paws. Severely dehydrated. Mild hypothermia. Likely some kind of virus, maybe parvovirus, but he's stronger than I expected. She looked at Whiskers. "And that," she said, "is one hell of a nurse." Martha prepared a subcutaneous hydration injection and administered it gently. Rusty didn't flinch. Whiskers watched every move. "I'll leave you with some supplies," Martha said, "but don't push too hard. He needs time." As the morning light stretched into the room, touching the cabin walls with gentle gold, Rusty dozed again, his breathing deeper now. Whiskers never moved more than a few inches away. Grace sat beside Jonas on the couch, legs curled beneath her. For a moment, there was no conversation, only the crackling of fire, the steady pulse of dawn, and the echo of tiny, returning heartbeats. "I used to think I needed to leave the world behind to heal," Grace said quietly. "Turns out, maybe it was waiting for me all along." Jonas didn't reply, but his eyes, resting on the tiny pup surrounded by warmth and purrs, said everything. The days passed quietly, a gentle rhythm settling over the ranger station like the hush between snowflakes. Willow Creek was deep in the cusp of winter now. Frost clung stubbornly to pine needles in the early hours, and the light took its time returning each morning. The cabin, once a lonely outpost, had become a place of breath and warmth, held together by flickering firelight, shared silences, and the slow healing of broken things. Rusty, the puppy once thought lost, now moved with timid curiosity. His body, though still fragile, had begun to fill out with strength. His coat was softer now, cleaner, revealing subtle copper tones in the tan. He followed Grace like a shadow, occasionally nuzzling at Jonas's boots or curling next to Whiskers, who remained both his guardian and quiet monarch of the cabin. Whiskers rarely ventured far, often perching on the windowsill or crouching near the fireplace, her amber eyes tracking the humans with a calm, inscrutable awareness. Jonas Reid had changed in small ways that weren't easily spoken. He shaved more regularly now, and the heavy set to his shoulders had eased slightly. Grace Miller, too, had begun leaving behind the cautious politeness of a newcomer. She moved through the station like she belonged, preparing tea without asking, scribbling lesson plans on the ranger's desk, while Rusty slept in her lap. One evening, as snow flurried softly against the windows, They sat together near the fire, Jonas in his usual armchair, Grace curled on the floor beside Rusty and Whiskers. A kettle whistled gently in the background. Grace spoke first. "Clara," she said, softly. "That was your wife's name, right?" Jonas looked at her, the fire reflecting off the storm gray of his eyes. He nodded once. She was a field biologist, studied lynx migration. She was the brave one. Grace waited. Jonas rarely shared more than necessary. She died in a landslide outside Helena. 8 years ago, next week. I still have her boots in the closet. Couldn't get rid of them. Grace's voice was a whisper. "I am sorry." Jonas gave a quiet shrug, the kind that didn't mean indifference, only weariness. "I thought if I stayed here long enough, the forest would take the weight. But turns out grief doesn't compost." They sat in silence for a long while. Then Grace said, "I was going to be a mother." She didn't look up. Her fingers toyed with the edge of Rusty's ear. 21 weeks in, I named her Ivy. We'd painted the nursery, even picked lullabies. And then it just stopped. Heartbeat gone. I don't know how something so alive can just vanish. Jonas didn't speak, but Whiskers rose from her place near the fire and padded over to Grace. The cat pressed her head against Grace's shoulder, a low, sustained purr vibrating through the silence. Grace blinked fast. She always does that when I talk about Ivy. Like she knows. Jonas watched the two of them for a moment, then leaned forward. Maybe she does. Maybe animals carry the parts of us we bury. Before Grace could answer, Rusty gave a low, uncertain growl from beneath the table. Whiskers immediately turned body taut, ears erect. Then Jonas heard it too, a sound from outside. A branch snapped, not like the natural creak of the forest, but something abrupt, intentional. Jonas rose in one swift motion, eyes narrowing. He moved to the window and drew the curtain aside just an inch. "Stay here," he said, already striding toward the door. He grabbed the rifle he kept hung above the mantel, a precaution rarely needed. Grace stood too, heart quickening. "What is it?" "Someone's out there," he said. "And it's not a hiker." Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The night was thick and bitter cold, and the moon cast long shadows through the pines. Jonas stepped silently onto the porch, boots sinking into the powder. He scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. But the air felt wrong. Too still. A soft metallic clicked to his left. He turned sharply, raising the rifle. Then came the snarl, low and chilling, echoing from behind the cabin. Whiskers. Jonas bolted around the side of the building, rifle ready. 2 men stood near the back shed, one holding a crowbar, the other a flashlight. Both wore thick coats, their faces shadowed beneath hoods. One had already jimmied the latch of the shed door. "Hey!" Jonas barked. The man with the crowbar turned fast, but before he could raise it, a sudden blur of gray shot between them. Whiskers. The cat launched herself straight at the man's leg, claws tearing into the fabric. He yelped, stumbling backward into the snow. His flashlight clattered to the ground. The second man cursed, reaching for his partner, but Jonas had already closed the distance, rifle aimed steady. "Get on the ground," he snapped. They froze. Grace appeared at the edge of the porch, phone in hand. "I'm calling Sheriff Hartley." The two intruders exchanged a glance. The one on the ground hissed, "It's just supplies, firewood and fuel." Jonas's voice was iron. "Then you can explain it to the sheriff." 15 minutes later, the flashing lights of the sheriff's cruiser lit up the tree lane. Sheriff Al Hartley, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with a steely presence and a thick winter coat, arrived to take the intruders into custody. He gave Jonas a firm nod of approval and asked for a full report the next morning. When the chaos settled and silence returned, Jonas knelt beside Whiskers, who now sat calmly on the snow, licking her paw. "You're a damn lion in a cat's coat," he whispered. Grace came to stand beside him. "She saved us." "No," Jonas said, eyes flicking to Rusty peeking timidly through the door. "She saved him." Again, inside the station, they fed Whiskers a can of salmon from the emergency stash, and Rusty curled up beside her, tail flicking softly in his sleep. Jonas glanced over Grace. "You should stay here tonight, just in case." Grace nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I will." The fire crackled again. Outside, the pines swayed gently, but the cabin stood safe, its warmth lit not just by flame, but by the fragile, growing trust between a ranger, a teacher, a pup, and a fierce silver ghost of the woods. The morning sun had barely crested over the snowy ridges of Willow Creek when the first call came in to the ranger station. Grace was at the stove, gently warming a pan of cornbread she'd brought from town, while Jonas reviewed field maps by the window. Rusty snored softly beneath the table, his tiny paws twitching in dreams. Whiskers, ever regal, sat on the windowsill as if surveying her kingdom. Jonas answered the ringing landline with a grunt of habit. Ranger station. A pause, then a bright, eager voice, too polished to belong to anyone from town. Is this the residence of Ranger Jonas Reid? We've heard remarkable reports. Something about a cat saving a puppy's life. Jonas stiffened. Where'd you hear that? A Facebook post from a volunteer named Martha Kincaid. It's gone viral. Over 300,000 shares overnight. We'd love to come up and do a human interest piece. Jonas sighed deeply. We're not interested in turning this place into a circus. The caller didn't miss a beat. It's an inspiring story. The world needs that right now. He hung up. Trouble? Grace asked, her back still turned. Media, he muttered. Grace turned, eyes wide. Already. Apparently it's gone viral. Grace paused, visibly torn. I know you hate attention, but maybe this isn't a bad thing. Jonas folded his arms. This is our place. There's two, he said, nodding toward Rusty and Whiskers. They're not an exhibit, but what if this helps other animals? What if someone sees it and thinks twice before abandoning a dog in a box? Or maybe someone donates to a rescue shelter or offers to foster. Her voice was quiet but firm. Maybe this little miracle means more if we share it. Jonas didn't answer, but he didn't argue either. Later that afternoon, at the corner cafe downtown, the townsfolk buzzed over mugs of hot cider and slices of spiced apple pie. Everyone in Willow Creek knew Martha Kincaid. Once a nurse, always the woman with a bandage in her pocket and a sharp opinion in her mouth. She stood now at the bakery counter, chatting with Emily Ross, the town librarian, a tall, elegant woman in her early 50s with short silver hair and thick-framed glasses. Swear on my father's grave, Martha was saying, that cat's smarter than most people I've treated. Emily adjusted her scarf. And the puppy's doing well. Alive and stubborn. The teacher's still out there, too. Good girl, that one. Brave. She sipped her tea. They're planning something, I think. Emily smiled. They should. People need hope. And the town could use a reminder of kindness that doesn't come from headlines. The door chimed as another visitor entered. Deputy Harper, a broad-shouldered woman in her late 30s with an authoritative walk, a dusting of freckles across her nose, and a thick brown braid tucked beneath her hat. She nodded toward Martha. Sheriff says to expect a couple reporters by morning. You sure you didn't start this? Martha only grinned. Didn't mean to, but maybe the right stories spread themselves. Back at the station, Jonas found Grace sitting cross-legged on the floor, sketching something on a legal pad. Rusty curled beside her, while Whiskers pawed gently at the edge of the page. What's that? He asked. Grace looked up a little sheepishly. A plan. For what? For a community event. I was thinking, if people are going to come anyway, maybe we make it something good. A fundraiser. Awareness. We could call it Wild Hearts Day. She turned the pad toward him. The rough drawing showed the outline of a pine tree, with silhouettes of a cat and a pup curled together at the base. Not about fame. About compassion. Jonas studied the page. His eyes rested on the small drawing, and something behind them softened. You're serious? I am. After a long pause, he gave a slow nod. All right, but stays here. No theatricals. No stage photo ops. Grace beamed. Deal. Over the next few days, the town rallied around the idea. Emily Ross offered to host a photo gallery at the library titled Paws and Pines with images of local rescue animals. The elementary school students began crafting paper animals with messages like, kindness is courage, and be someone's shelter. Martha recruited a retired vet tech to help lead a first aid demo for pets. Deputy Harper agreed to help manage traffic on the event day and even offered to bring her old beagle, Samson, who had lost a leg in a rescue years ago. Grace designed flyers while Jonas coordinated with local shelters. Word spread quickly, this time intentionally. The day of the event, the ranger station's clearing transformed. Bunting made from recycled flannel shirts flapped gently in the breeze. Tables lined with pet food donations, handmade treats, and wildlife awareness pamphlets stretched across the yard. Children laughed as they painted animal faces and played rescue-themed games. Musicians strummed acoustic guitars beside the fire pit, where hot cider simmered in large tin kettles. Rusty trotted proudly through the crowd, his tiny bandana reading Miracle Pup, while Whiskers, despite every prediction, remained nearby, perched like a queen on a bale of hay, tolerating the attention with the grace of a creature who knew her worth. Near the end of the afternoon, a woman approached Grace. She was in her late 40s, with a weathered face and hands that spoke of hard work. She held the leash of a scruffy mutt with wide brown eyes. "I just want to say thank you," she said, her voice tight. "I saw the story. I wasn't a good dog owner before. I left mine out in the cold too long sometimes. I didn't know better, but I do now." She looked at Grace, then over to Jonas. "Today reminded me. They trust us. They don't forget. I won't either." Grace nodded, emotion catching in her throat. "That's why we're here." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the clearing, Jonas stood beside Grace. Rusty curled between their boots, Whiskers nearby. Music played softly. Laughter echoed. And for the first time in years, the ranger station didn't feel like a place of silence, but a place where scars, both seen and unseen, were finally healing. The first golds of autumn returned to Willow Creek like a gentle whisper, brushing the trees with fire-kissed leaves and dappling the forest trails with color. The ranger station sat nestled in the heart of this transformation, its old timber frame now softened by pumpkins on the steps, hand-painted signs from local children, and a faint, lingering scent of cinnamon and pine. It was no longer just a shelter in the woods. It was something more. Rusty, the once frail puppy, now bounded through fallen leaves with a joy that made even the most stoic ranger crack a smile. His fur had filled out into a gleaming copper coat, his legs stronger, though still a bit clumsy when he got excited. A green bandana now hung from his collar, embroidered by Grace's students with tiny paw prints and the words "Brave Little Heart." He followed Grace almost everywhere, especially now that she was spending most nights at the ranger station. She had moved in gradually, first with a toothbrush, then a second pair of boots, and eventually her favorite kettle and dog-eared poetry books. Whiskers remained as steady and enigmatic as ever. The silver-gray cat had claimed the windowsill above the kitchen sink as her throne and spent most afternoons sunbathing with one eye lazily half open. Though still wary of strangers, she had grown visibly calmer, occasionally even choosing to curl up beside Jonas during early morning coffee. She had a loud touch, tentative at first, but in recent weeks, something remarkable had happened. She had let herself be held. It was on a rainy Thursday morning. Grace had crouched beside her while the cat lay near the fire and simply scooped her up, slowly, gently. And Whiskers hadn't hissed or leapt away. She had stayed in Grace's arms, a quiet, vibrating bundle of warmth, her head pressed against Grace's collarbone. Jonas had watched the moment in silence, knowing better than to interrupt something sacred. It was this moment that had inspired Grace's idea for the small ceremony. Something quiet, simple, and deeply personal. Not a performance, but a marker in time. A beginning. On the day of the ceremony, a light breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and dry bark through the trees. Grace had chosen a spot just behind the cabin, beneath a grand old maple whose limbs curled like the arms of an ancient protector. Its leaves blazed in reds and oranges, forming a canopy above and a carpet below. A small bench stood in the clearing, decorated with wildflowers gathered by Grace and a shy local teen named Lucas, who volunteered on weekends and had a soft spot for animals. Lucas, 16 and lanky with a mess of curly brown hair and oversized flannel shirts, rarely spoke unless spoken to. He had started coming to the station after reading about Whiskers and Rusty in the paper. Jonas had taken to him quickly, offering chores and gentle guidance without demanding conversation. Now Lucas stood off to the side, hands in pockets, watching with a faint smile as Grace adjusted the collar on Rusty and set a small wooden tag beside Whiskers. It read, "Whiskers, Guardian of Hearts." A handful of close friends had come. Martha Kincaid in her signature hiking vest and patched jeans, Emily Ross in a scarf that matched the autumn trees, Deputy Harper in her uniform, standing with arms crossed and a rare glint of sentiment in her eyes. Jonas, dressed simply in a wool sweater and khaki ranger trousers, stepped forward with a folded piece of paper in hand. He cleared his throat. This place used to be quiet. Real quiet. I thought that meant peace. Turns out, it just meant empty. He looked at Grace. And then you showed up, with a puppy in one hand and 1,000 stories in the other. And somehow, things changed. He turned to the crowd. Rusty taught us about resilience. Whiskers reminded us of loyalty. Grace, you reminded me how to care again. Grace blinked fast, biting her lower lip to hide the tremble. And so today, Jonas continued, we honor not just a story that spread online, but the story we made here, together. He stepped aside, and Grace approached with Rusty beside her, tail wagging. She held a hand-carved plaque Jonas had made, the wood etched with the words, "A home for all hearts." She placed it gently at the base of the tree. Then, in a gesture so natural it surprised them both, Grace took Jonas's hand. He didn't flinch. In fact, he held on tighter. The group clapped softly. It wasn't a loud celebration. It was the kind that lives quietly in the bones. After the others had departed, leaving behind their laughter and warm wishes, Jonas and Grace remained in the clearing. Whiskers, true to her nature, had climbed into the crook of a low branch, tail curled neatly around her paws, watching the world with eyes like burning coins. Rusty had fallen asleep in a pile of leaves, legs sprawled, nose twitching. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden rays across the forest. Grace sat beside Jonas on the bench, their shoulders touching. "I think we made something good here," she said softly. Jonas looked at her, his voice steady. "We didn't make it. We let it happen." They sat in silence, the good kind. Whiskers leapt down gracefully, padded over to Rusty, and curled beside him. The two lay together, side by side, as they had the first night, only now, not in fear, not in cold, but in peace. And in the stillness of the fading day, under the blaze of a red maple tree, for hearts rested quietly. Not just alive, but whole. Sometimes the most powerful acts of love come from the quietest hearts. A stray cat didn't need words to teach us about loyalty. A forgotten puppy didn't need strength to remind us that even the smallest lives are worth saving. In a world that often rushes past pain, this story reminds us to slow down, to care, to believe in second chances. If this touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below. Say amen if you believe every soul deserves love. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that bring light to the darkest places. May God bless you and all those who choose kindness.